came out of Africa and spread throughout the world from Africa about 55,000 years ago. Maybe it's quite possible, actually, I think, that it was actually something that the community was doing back in Africa 55, 60,000 years ago, and maybe even considerably more. The talent and the mindset of these people that had minds very much like ours. This is a computer enhancement of the same painting on the wall. So there's something unique about our species. There's a whole set of these characteristics that are unique about our species. And they're listed here. They're either unique or at least they're certainly exaggerated, this whole set of qualities, characteristics that we have. In the middle is magical thinking, and that would certainly be associated, for example, with that, we can think of it at least as being that lion man statue. On the left-hand side, we have beliefs about death, and we can see the evidence for that they had that. We can see the funerary practice, we saw that, representational art. Animals don't do these kinds of things. This is something that's unique to the human lineage and probably Homo sapiens specifically. Other qualities are involved with recognizing the mind of another. And so, for example, we have the ability animals don't intentionally deceive another individual. We have that capability, which tells us, the fact that we have that capability of intentionally deceiving tells us that we have to be able to recognize the mind of the other and a little bit about how it works and how we can manipulate it and try to deceive it. That's a human quality, to be able to recognize the mind of another in that way. And the same would be true for concern for reputation. It implies that we have an understanding of what we need to do to ensure that the other individual thinks well of us. And so we're working on how their mind works at the same time as we're thinking about how we would behave in that same circumstance. And teaching, of course, if you're going to be able to teach, especially teaching well, you're going to teaching animals, even chimpanzees. The infant and the young chimpanzee observes his or her mother, father, in terms of what they're doing. If they're carrying, they may well use tools, but the adult does not teach. And so it's a human quality, and it requires a kind of somewhat profound understanding of the mind of another and how that works in order to effectively teach. A number of these, not all of them, and certainly the three that I've just talked about, do depend upon some kind of an understanding of how the mind of another works. This is called a theory of mind. It means we're able to have a theory about how the mind of another works. And so as we go through this list, which we're not going to do, but if we were to go through this list, we would be able to see a whole set of them, like acting in this particular case, which depends upon being able to understand the mind to some extent, maybe a fairly extensive extent actually, of the other. So there are different levels we can think in terms of theory of mind, and of course many animals would have a theory about their own mind, and they would have intentionality of their own, I should put it that way. And so in this cartoon we see three different examples of different levels of theory of mind. And in the first case, that individual is looking over and seeing the apple of the girl on his right, and he's thinking to himself that he would like to be able to take that apple, and that's what's on his mind. And that's an example of first order of intentionality. That level of what he's doing right there. It's not to say he wouldn't be able to do more, but that's what he's doing. The girl is doing something a little more sophisticated. She is looking at him, and by looking at him and how he's behaving, she becomes suspicious of what's on his mind, and what she begins to think about what's on his mind is he's going to take her apple. And so she's exhibiting what we call second order of intentionality, a slightly more sophisticated aspect of thinking about the mind of another. And then the person on the right, he's looking at the girl and he's thinking about the girl, and he says to himself, I think that she's thinking about the boy, and she's thinking about the boy that he is going to take her apple, and so this is a good time for me to be able to reach across and take the apple myself. And so this is called third level of intentionality, where he is thinking about what one person is thinking about another person. And so there are these different levels of intentionality associated with theory of mind, and they can get pretty sophisticated. We would probably have something like what they consider the fifth order of intentionality, that is related not just simply that we're trying to always think about what somebody else thinks is things. I mean, that's not what they mean by that, but this level related to the sophistication of our ability to perceive social nuances, and it's pretty sophisticated in our case, somewhere around fifth order of intentionality. Theory of mind is just been a very important part of who we are as a species. Extremely important part of who we are as a species. So here you can see these examples of theory of mind at work, and on the top left-hand corner, there's the father teaching, right, his child, and recognizing what's going to be effective and what's going on in the child's mind. On the right, we have a whole group of people. Just think in terms of that many chimpanzees all gathered together, it would be chaos. And here, there's this organized cooperative spirit where everybody's doing their job, and it requires a fair amount of understanding and interacting with each other in a sophisticated way. Animals don't do anything like that. You can see on the bottom left-hand corner, that we can look at that girl in the foreground, look at her eyes, and we can become suspicious about what sorts of things are on her mind right now, and she's probably, it looks to me a little like maybe there's some gossip taking place here, and we're able to kind of look into the face of another, and we're able to make conclusions about what is on their mind, and this kind of thing has been really important to our success as a species. So on the bottom right is a whole set of tools, and of course we can keep on going with the tools, the various kinds of tools, including up to today, and the level of sophistication of our tools and the teaching that is required as we develop tools together that are ever more extensive, as we talk together and teach each other and communicate with each other. Tool use and tool production is a function of a profound theory of mind. Animals may have what we could refer to as second order of intentionality in some cases. And of course, there's very remarkable developments with respect to certain birds, as I'm sure you know about. And they can recognize, all of these animals that are listed here, at least have some kind of secondary level of intentionality where they would recognize in some way the intentions of another, but it stops at that, and it doesn't go any further into the more extended theories of mind. And so it's very interesting that there's something special happened in our case that has not happened in other animals, that has allowed us to proceed to third and fourth levels of intentionality, which the other animals are not able to do. So it's taken us into some very special territory, this theory of mind and the nature of our theory of mind. As Thomas Aquinas said, not knowing anything, of course, about theory of mind those hundreds of years ago, but as Thomas Aquinas said in thinking about the human being, he said, not only do we understand, but we understand that we understand. And that's what especially makes us different, is our ability not just to understand. Animals can understand, other animals can understand, but we understand that we understand. And in that process, we are able to be individuals who can reflect. It was Terence Deacon, who's a priest and paleontologist, wrote a great book called The Phenomenon of Man, 1930s. Very controversial Catholic priest. He wasn't allowed to publish the book and it wasn't published until after he died. but it's a remarkable book, well ahead of its time. And he was able to recognize there's a lot of things that maybe especially can't take the time to do that right now. But one of the things that was important about what he wrote is that he says of all the species in the animal world, we alone are reflective. And the significance of that cannot be overstated. Because we are reflective, Chardin said, we are not only different, but we are quite other. It's not merely a matter of change of degree, he said, but a change of nature resulting from a change of state. One of my favorite anthropologists is Terence Deacon from the University of California, Berkeley. And Terence Deacon says that we find ourselves intuitively and irresistibly looking beyond the surface for hidden meanings. We're always looking, putting things together. I mean, language itself is symbolic, and we are predetermined to be individuals who are trying to put meaning together. And in fact, so important, Terence Deacon said, so important is this attribute, this unique quality of human beings. He said, although we have the body, basically the body of an ape, and it hasn't changed that much, in essence, because of the mind and the nature of our mind, he says, in essence, we ought to think about ourselves as almost being a whole new phylum. Even though we certainly have the body of an ape and we're a primate and so on, there's something new that emerges, and important that emerges with the quality of our social mind. Our mind that is geared towards others. We're always looking for meaning. And so as we reach up and look to something more, whatever that might mean, whatever it meant way back then, we are also, according to Moltmann, I think Christian theology in general would say that God is looking down at us too. So as we have that growing capability of reaching up, God reaches down in ways that are different. I mean, God is always love. I'm going to say more about that in just a minute. God is always love, but we are able to respond in a different way, and God is able to reach down in a way that might be a little bit different at that point. But that's what I really want to focus on at this point, is that as we reach down and God reaches, as we reach up and God reaches down, we're left with a situation which I think is just really fundamental to I mean, I love these verses. We're going to look at 3 verses from 1 John chapter 4, one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, where we read, no one has ever seen God, right? But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. So we look at these various pictures here. We can't see God, but we see the ramifications of the presence of God because God is love. And so we know and rely on the love that God has for us, fundamental to who we are. God is love. By definition, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God lives in them. And finally, let us love one another. For love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. So, God's love has no beginning. God has always been love. And God loves all creatures. God loves creation. It was out of love that all of creation was created. God's love has no beginning. But what differs is the mind's ability to reflect. What differs is the mind's ability to reflect and to respond to that love. And that comes with an extended theory of mind, which we have which our ancestors came to have, and we are the beneficiaries of that, and that's what sets us especially apart. So, if the love of God was always there, then we have to ask the question, what about the love of God in these communities, these little communities? Early Homo sapiens probably, most people would say, most scholars would say, existed in small groups most of their time, in maybe small groups of 25 or something like that. Not to say that they never interacted with other small groups. They may well have had another 4 or 5 groups that they interacted with, but in essence, they functioned within these small groups where reputation was important, where they got to know each other pretty well, and we can ask that question, what about that? No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. So, God would be, I think Scripture is telling us, in these little communities 40, 50, 60, 70,000 years ago, and maybe more, where we had full, extended theory of mind. I'd like to, and thinking about this, I'd like to reflect with you on the perspective of John Wesley. We are a Wesleyan school, and Seattle Pacific is also, SPU is also a Wesleyan school, so I want to think with you a little bit about John Wesley, who was a great preacher and thinker, theologian of the mid-1700s, and so a long time ago. And this is from a book by my colleague at Point Loma, Michael Lodall, and he's reflecting on Wesley in ways that I think are relevant to the question that I want to address, and that is, so what about those individuals from 70,000 years ago and more? How ought we think about that? So for Wesley, for sure, Wesley had no idea there were people around at 70,000 years ago. I wouldn't want to imply anything like that. He had no idea of that. He would have been, anything he writes might have been going back 5,000 years or something like that. But nonetheless, for Wesley, there is no human being who has ever existed, who was not deeply loved and immediately graced by God. Thus, no human being lives without the Spirit's wooing to live compassionately and justly with all others. Everyone has some measure of that light, some faint glimmering ray, which sooner or later, more or less, this part is a direct quote, the earlier part was Michael Lodall's summary, but this is a direct quote from Wesley. Everyone has some measure of that light, some faint glimmering ray, which sooner or later, more or less, enlightens every man that cometh into the world. That's the first quote that I want to give you from thinking about John Wesley and his thought as it relates to early humans. Again, Wesley's suggestion is that the standard will depend upon the quality and the quantity of light that a person has received from God, from within the particularities of her history, her culture, their history, their society, education, and then from Wesley, because he's got this little quote, and 1,000 other circumstances. So what we have here then, what Wesley is saying, that it's related to the circumstances, it's related to the particularities of the life in which they're living, and the quality and quantity of light will vary depending upon 1,000 other circumstances. Then one last quote from Wesley, regarding Wesley, also still from Mike Lodall's book, Matthew Matters. Wesley appealed to Luke chapter 12, verse 43, which says this: "From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required." It's a pretty famous verse. And so he appealed to that, and he said, to argue, and so he appealed to that, and he used that to argue that lesser light implies a reduced measure of answerability for both modern heathens of his own age, right? 1750, modern heathens, what he called, that's his word, his term, modern heathens of his own age. But then also, and this is Wesley saying this, and also ancient heathens of millennia prior. No more, therefore, will be expected of them than the living up to the light that they had. So Wesley, when he thought about millennia, he was probably thinking 4 or 5 millennia or something like that. But we know that it extends. We now know that it's not just 4 or 5 millennia; it's thousands of. It's tens of millennia, and maybe even more than that. That they would have had a fairly extensive theory of mind. This is a really interesting and important quote from a lot of these people are my kind of scholarly heroes. And this is certainly one. His name is Agustin Fuentes. He's written a book that I highly recommend to you called The Creative Spark. And he, in this particular, this is not from that book, but there are very few mainstream, in research universities, anthropologists who are ever writing, and I've read a lot of books on this now, and I guess I think that it's only Agustin Fuentes who's raised this other issue. So when they think in terms of, nobody disputes, well, I guess that some people would question how important religion was in our becoming the species that we became. Most people think religion is universal, right? All different cultures around the world through the last several centuries that have been identified have some form of religion. So it's a universal, and so it seems quite possible to many scholars that religion was an important part of making us, that reaching out, that believing in something more may well have been important. But the anthropologists that I read, and I've read quite a few now, they put it in the context of what we are able to do as humans as we develop religion, not to say there's anything out there. Agustin Fuentes, a Princeton scholar, says this. He says, the human niche is not necessarily bounded by material borders. We got to consider that, right? The human niche is not necessarily bounded by material borders, he says. Thus, multiple modes of inquiry, especially those that engage with transcendental components as a core premise, may be particularly beneficial when asking questions about the human. So that sounds like theology. That sounds like we ought to be, he's the only one saying that I found. I'm sure there's others, but in terms of most of the books by anthropologists and articles by anthropologists, they're just not considering this possibility of something on the outside. And in the research realm of secular universities. So the implication then is that if there is something more outside of this boundary of the material, that which we can touch and feel and see, if there is something more than that, then we can ask the question, what impact would the input from that which is out there, beyond the bounds, what impact might that have on our development of a species? We can't go back in time and study the impact of that which was outside. We can't do that kind of an experiment to be able to look at that and dissect it. However, what we can do is we can do sort of an analogous type of experiment, where it's not a human culture, but it's an animal culture where there's outside interference, an animal culture where there is something outside that's impacting what's going on inside of the world of this particular group of animals. And so what's that experiment? Well, I'm going to talk about an experiment related to foxes, where we have an outside influence on wild foxes. It's the only time actually that foxes we've got lots of domesticated animals, which clearly different species of animals, which were clearly domesticated by human interference, made less aggressive and become tame through interaction with humans. But all of that was done with the exception of a wonderful experiment I'll tell you about now with foxes. All of that was done prior to any recording of the events how it actually took place. But with foxes, it was different because in 1959, a Russian geneticist by the name of Belayev did an experiment with foxes. And he decided that he was going to try to see if he could breed wild foxes and cause them to become less aggressive, in other words, domesticated. And so he started breeding with a group of foxes that generation after generation, he selected for the ones, the offspring that were the least, that were the least aggressive, the tamest ones. This shows two cages in his experiments, and you can see the foxes on the right. A person has come by. There's a person on the one on the left too. The one on the right, they've been selected for non-aggressiveness. The other ones have not been selected for non-aggressiveness. And look, they look like puppy dogs. They've got big long tails. Their tails are waggy. They're excited to see the person come in. Now the other one on the left, not very happy about having a person standing there looking into the cage, trying to reach into the cage. He will take a little nip here in just a little bit, and bark, and is very different in terms of his persona. This began to happen after just 8 to 10 generations of selecting for these foxes for non-aggressiveness. But it didn't take very long. They've continued the breeding, and it's continued to this experiment that is still ongoing. And so, but by 8 to 10, they were already showing considerable impact of the effect of the change in genotype, the change in their genetic makeup. So it didn't take long for that genetic makeup to change as a result of that outside interference. So in addition to their change in temperament, there are some other things that happened. So they developed floppy ears. They developed a kind of pushed-in, shorter snout. They had reduced pigmentation. You can see the white down below the mouth and on the breast area. You can see the lighter color in the eyebrows. And the fox color itself is a lighter color than in the wild type. They have more reproductive cycles. They are puppy-like for a longer period of time. They have reduced size of the adrenal gland, which results in less cortisol being produced, and thereby a tamer, more relaxed demeanor and differences in the brain chemical serotonin, which is associated with a tamer disposition. So in addition to having, a lower level of aggression, they had a number of these other characteristics, and this is true of domestic animals in general. They don't all have exactly the same suite. They don't necessarily all have floppy ears or curly tails, but the suite as a whole is associated, even though they've been selected for a lower level of aggression, there's these other things that seem to come along for the ride. And the question is, why do they come along for the ride? Why the reduced pigmentation, especially on the underside? Why the smaller skulls? Why the pushed-in face? Those are characteristics that are frequently associated with domesticated species compared to their wild-type counterpart. And this was specifically now a case in the fox. It was studied step by step by step. And so that's what makes the experiments with foxes special. And there are some very good ideas about how this came to be, and I'm going to just describe one, the main hypothesis which exists today, and is fairly well accepted now, as to why when you select for tameness and non-aggressiveness, there are these other characteristics. So this is a diagram here of an adult fox, but you have to imagine it's just too complex to show the embryo. We're actually looking at the embryo stage, and we're going to be looking at the there's some cells that are on either side of the spinal cord, what will become the spinal cord here, that migrate out. They're called neural crest cells. They migrate out, and many of you, anybody taking developmental biology knows all about this. They migrate out and around to the surface, and depending on the type of cell, some of them are ending up producing, as they migrate, they end up becoming pigment-producing cells. Some of them end up becoming cells that make I hope you can hear me. I'm stepped away from this. They become cells of the face, making the bone of the face. They become cells that contribute to the cartilage of the bone. If the organism has a tail, they produce cells that become part of the cartilage of the tail, and so on. So these are neural crest cells, and they also, these migrating neural crest cells also affect the brain. And they don't produce part of the brain, but they actually affect the brain. So the model is that what happens when an organism like a fox or even other animals become domesticated, the genetic changes are associated with the migration. They cause an inability to migrate as efficiently for the neural crest cells. So the reason they have less pigment is because the neural crest cells have been genetically altered such that they don't migrate as far, they migrate slower, there's not as many of them. And so as a result, we have all these other characteristics. When we genetically change the fox or whatever the organism is, what we're changing, this is the idea, and many people are now accepting this as it's not proven yet though. What we're doing is we're actually selecting for a reduced migration of the neural crest cells. And so if you select for a reduced migration of the neural crest cells, you get a tamer, calmer, less aggressive personality, and you get these other things going along for the ride. So important is this that a whole book has been written on it, actually a couple of books. This one is called Survival of the Friendliest. And what these authors, Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods are saying in this book is they are saying, and it's a wonderful book, I highly recommend it, it's very, very readable. And what they're saying is that they're saying that actually the basis of our success is that we have become friendly, like the fox. Like the foxes in Dalieva's experiment, we have become social creatures that have been able to interact well with each other and been able to cooperate well with each other. We're not as aggressive. And so that's what they're saying, that we in essence have become, they're not saying it's exactly the same as domestication of animals, but they're saying something like that. And it's not too surprising when you stop and think about it, because we're mammals. We're primates, we're mammals. And so the kinds of things that affect other mammals, the processes may well work the same, may work similarly in our case. However, what they say, and this is interesting, they say that domesticating a wolf brain or an ape brain is impressive. And of course, domesticating a wolf brain, you know what that is, that's a dog, domesticated wolf. And so that's impressive, of course. We love our dogs. But when you domesticate a human brain, they say, this is when the real magic happens. An ultra-cultural species is born, a unique type of friendliness that must have evolved in our species. All right, so that's what they suggest, but how would we know? Oh, it's just a nice idea, but how would we know? Another good book I might say, if you're interested in following up on this more, is a book called The Goodness Paradox, written in I think both of these books were written in 2018 to 2020, somewhere in there. So how would we know? Well, there's no human. How would we know whether something like domestication has happened to us in our species? So there is no human equivalent of Valiev's fox experiments, of course. This is from them. But we're lucky in one respect, and that is that domestication fossilizes. Domestication fossilizes. What in the world do they mean by that? Well, here's what they mean. Remember, domestication is associated with in the foxes. It's associated with changes in the face. It's a little bit pushed in. It's now a little shorter, and this is true of in domestication in general. That there's a smaller skull size and a smaller face, a reduction in the face size. So we can look at what's happened in our species, and these are two sets of Homo sapiens skulls. The one on the left is from 100,000 100,000, they did many, it's actually analyzed quantitatively, but these are two pictures. And so the ones on the left are from 100,000 years ago, the ones on the right are modern humans. And if you look closely at the eyebrows, you can see the brow ridges. You can see that there's considerable difference between the two. There has been a reduction in the brow ridge of our species with time. Furthermore, if you go on and look at the difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens on the left this time, Neanderthals on the right, you can see a very significant difference, of course, in the brow ridge. There's been a reduction in the face, in the bones of the face, in the brow ridge region, and that is what they mean when they say domestication fossilizes. They mean that this is evidence, at least, that maybe something like domestication has happened. We can ask the question, well, how could that be associated with friendliness? Would there be any benefit of that? And the answer is that we are the species of high levels of where communication skills have been extremely important to who we have become, because we are, in a sense, a group of connected brains and connected minds, I should say. And so we need to be able to communicate with each other. It's been very important to our success as a species. And so reducing the brow ridge undoubtedly would help with respect to, I mean, of course, all animals have some sort of body language, but I mean, all mammals, I guess, but it's taken to the extreme in our case. And when you think about the face, and it's almost like a second language. Nowhere near as good, of course, and nowhere near as nuanced as our verbal language, but nonetheless, we can learn an awful lot by looking at a person's face. And the brow ridges play a role in that. We can look at these. We can look. I mean, this is something which is universal, which tells us it's been a long time, been around for a long time. All human cultures have this flash of the eyebrow, and it means the same thing in all these different cultures. A few more examples. We can look at it, and we can see what's going on. We can read that person's mind, this person's mind in each one of these cases by looking at their face, and an important part of that is actually the brow ridge itself. And so by making the brow ridge less pronounced, by smoothing it out, it allows the brow ridges to function more efficiently in communicating our internal state with each other. So what I'd like to do now is to kind of lay out a model of how our species came to be. And I'm going to do this by thinking a little bit with you about the activity of God, like the God grounded in revelation, the God grounded in what we know of God from Scripture and revelation, and the nature of God. And so that's going to be part of this little model that I want to put forward. And then we're also going to do it from the perspective. We're also going to look at this from the perspective of the biology. And so we want to look at if there is a God, and if it's the God of Christian theology, what would we expect as if that God is love, and that God is love going all the way back. And by the same token, knowing what we do about genes and biology, how can we expect that interaction to be taking place? Well, I'm going to lay out a few principles then as to how we might think about this. First of all, starting off with God is love. And communities where love was prevalent functioned. This is my first principle. Not hard to think in terms of expecting that if love is flourishing, if love is prevalent, that they would function more harmoniously than those in which love was not prevalent. That's principle number one. God is love. Communities where love is prevalent function more harmoniously. Principle number two. Because God is love, communities where love flourished would have been drawn into the presence of the Spirit of God. That's even when their conception of God was rudimentary, because God is love, period. And I'll harken back a little bit to what Wesley had to say about that, the differences in level of light. So communities where love flourished would have drawn into the presence of the Spirit of God, and that would be true even if they had pretty rudimentary understanding of God, or maybe no understanding of God at all. That's principle number two. Principle number three. Communities that lived in harmony with the Spirit of God and each other, they would have thrived, right? Because if you live in harmony, God, each other, you would expect those communities to thrive. Just little communities, 25, 30 people. Thereby increasing in population size faster than those which did not. You might be able to see kind of a selective process going on here, like the Falk experiment. Principle number 4. At least one community lived like this for a succession of generations. Now we know from the Falk experiments that it might not have had to take a very long period of time. 8 generations, 10 generations, there were significant changes taking place, but it could have. Who knows how long it would have been taking place, but we're saying at least one community lived like this for a succession of generations, perhaps probably at least several hundred years, that there would be a success of generations. Goodness is contagious to some extent. Wouldn't be too surprised to think in terms of that happening. Of course, there'd be little problems, I'm sure, along the way. Principle number 5, genetic variants which enhanced cooperation would gradually increase in the community. So genetic variants that resulted in less aggressiveness, for example. Genetic variants that resulted in increased cooperation. That would be things like bones on the brow ridge, moving towards language, being able to communicate more effectively with each other. Genetic variants which enhanced cooperation would gradually increase in the community. Principle 6, the Spirit of God, in partnership with humankind, God, Spirit, and humankind together would have brought about a whole new way of being into existence. Right, so that's the idea. And the question is whether we can begin to think about what some of these genetic variants might be. I'm a geneticist, so this is the part which gets it. But I love theology too. But I'm a geneticist, and so this gets pretty close to the part which is very dear to my heart. This next little section, because I want to be able to identify. I want to be able to think about. So from the biological point of view, what are the sorts of genes that might have been that we might have been able to? Are we at a point now in our understanding of genetics that we can begin to identify the genes that might be involved? So I want to look at a few genes, a little interesting set of genes on chromosome 7. And so there's a little segment of chromosome 7 that when it's deleted, just a little tiny segment, 25 genes out of the 1,000 genes on chromosome 7, that when that little segment is deleted, it results in a very interesting phenotype. Let's take a look at that, the effect of that genotype. Now I'm going to hope this video plays because I had to go to the internet for this one. So it's going to play, I hope. If not, I'll be telling you about it. Okay, it's not, it looks to me like it's not going to, we did a little test on it earlier, but it was working fine, but it's not going out to the internet. So anyways, I'm going to tell you about this, and if you want to take a look at this later on, it's called the little movie Embraceable. The movie is called Embraceable, and this is a little 1.5 minute trailer from that movie, which can be rented as well. It's a 48-minute movie. And so there's a syndrome, the syndrome with the deletion that I was talking about is called Williams syndrome. And these individuals, I actually almost brought to tears. No, I shouldn't say almost, I was actually am brought to tears sometimes when I look at this little video. These children are so delightfully happy, and they're so social. They are so social. Now, there's it's a deletion. They only have one copy. I should just say something about it. I guess I can go on to that next slide. They actually have, so we all have 2 copies of our chromosomes. And so they have 2 copies of chromosome 7, but one of them carries the deletion. The one on the right carries the deletion of 25 or so genes. And so having only 1 copy instead of 2 copies of this block of 25 genes results in a very significant change then in their personality, and they also have a lower IQ, and so it's a IQ around 60 or something like that. But on the other hand, they are often very, very musical, just amazing, actually. Some of their musical skills. It seems as though, we won't, I mean, there's some ideas about what that is. But the important thing to me right now is that when you see these individuals and how they are happy, they love to interact with each other. One of them says, I have to be careful. I want to hug everybody, but I have to be careful because they tell me that people will not understand when I want to go around and hug everybody. And so they have that knowledge, but at the same time, and so they have to kind of suppress their level of sociality. And so this is caused by a particular gene, one of the genes that is present in only one copy. We now know which gene it is, and it's this gene that I've indicated here. And this particular gene, we know what that gene is and what it does, pretty much. It's a gene which is a master control gene. Now, what that means is that it controls the activity or the expression of other genes. And so, just briefly, in a minute or so, what I mean by a master control gene. So if you can think in terms of a master thermostat in these days of smart rooms and smart houses where you have a master thermostat and then you can set the temperature of different rooms, and so it controls all the different rooms. Master control genes are sort of like that. They control the level of expression of a whole set of different genes. So this gene is a master control gene that influences, those of you that know about molecular biology, you know about something called a transcription factor, and this is a transcription factor. Influences the transcription or the expression of a whole set of other genes. And so that's the type of gene that this is. And so turning down the thermostat, basically, is what we can think of, turning down the level of expression of this gene results in excessive friendliness, excessive sociality. And we know this gene is important because it plays a role in domestication of dogs and foxes. And so when they become domesticated, dogs and foxes, when they become domesticated, they change the level, they change the expression of this very same gene. And experiments have been done with mice, and it also affects the level of the same gene is present in mice, and also by changing the level of expression of this gene in mice, it also affects their level of aggressiveness. So this is a gene that was likely, the data is still coming in, but it was likely altered and played a role in our becoming the social species that we have become. There's another gene I want to talk about in this region, and there'll be others that people are still investigating. It's a very interesting region. This one is called BAS1B, and this gene is also important. This gene is known to be important in making the bone. It's also it's also a regulatory gene, master regulator gene. So it's like a thermostat. And in this particular case, since these children and adults, they live into adulthood, this gene is turned down as well because it's only one copy, so there's less expression of this gene, and so this gene then is underexpressed in people with Williams syndrome. There's some facial deformities associated with that, as you would have seen if we've been able to play the trailer. It's a master control gene, and it's very interesting because this gene is known to be involved in making the facial bone, which is a very important part, as we've already seen actually, of domestication. The shorter face and the smaller skull. So this is a gene which is important in facial bone. We know that because this gene and some of the genes that it sets, the downstream thermostats, some of the genes that it sets are genes that when they are abnormal, they result in, we just know this from various genetic syndromes, that when various genes that are regulated by BAS1B are abnormal, individuals are born which have various facial deformities. So this is a gene which we know is involved and important in the formation of facial bone. And it does this, and we now know this, the reduction in BAS1B, we can see that it reduces the migration of those neural crest cells. Remember I told you about those neural crest cells that migrate from the back area of an embryo and start moving around? So this gene actually slows down the movement of neural crest cells. That's how it works. That's what it does. And we now know, in this case, the data is stronger than it is for the other gene I told you about. We now know that this gene has been altered. We have the genetic data, the exact data to show that this gene has indeed been altered in the human lineage. And furthermore, not only has it been altered compared to archaic humans, older human lineage, we have the DNA of archaic, of Neanderthals specifically, and it's altered relative to the archaic type of gene. So it's been altered, and furthermore, not only has it been altered, but it's been shown that there's selective advantage, that there is, by that I mean individuals that have this alteration that has taken place have reproduced at a higher level, have reproduced more efficiently. And so as a result, we can look at this and we can say, here's a gene which has been altered and it's been to our advantage. More children have been produced as a result of the alteration of this gene, and it's associated with the kinds of things we get with something like with domestication. Whether humans, we can think of, I'm sure that domestication it's only, I have to use the term domestication-like in the humans, that there'd be some similarities. I'm sure there's major differences as well. So with now concluding, with just I want to conclude from a theological perspective. I want to put this back into a theological perspective. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what three theologians have said. They're not biologists, and they weren't writing necessarily thinking about biology as they wrote them, nor about this process of evolution that we've been talking about. But they have important things to say that I think bear on the question we're examining. First of all, John B. Taylor, in the book 1973, The Go-Between God, writes, with the appearance of human reason, right? Appearance of human reason. So I guess he is kind of talking, he was aware of evolution, and so he's thinking about that at this point. With the appearance of human reason, choice consciously takes over from chance the direction of the evolutionary process. In Christian terms, this means that the Creator Spirit works from the inside of the processes by startling his creatures into awareness and recognition and luring them towards even higher degrees of consciousness and personhood. That's that outside influence I've been talking about, except that what he's saying here is a spirit, which of course means it's on the inside of us. This is John Webster, another one of my favorite theologians. Providence is that work of divine love for temporal creatures, whereby God ordains and executes their fulfillment in fellowship with himself. God wants to have fellowship, us to have fellowship with God's self. God loves creatures, so he orders their course to perfection. We still got a ways to go. Thirdly, this is David Ferguson, University of Edinburgh, and he writes this. In an important sense, we must have been intended. Hence, we are inevitable in the course of evolution. Both creation stories in Genesis reinforce this anthropocentric assumption, as does the doctrine of the incarnation. According to the cosmic Christology of the New Testament, the human appearance of the Word of God was intended from the outset to bring creation to its appointed goal. This suggests an inherent direction in the course of evolution. So, thinking about the title of the talk, Human Inevitability in a Lonely Universe, the answer is yes, but it is because of the Spirit of God at work in our creation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for your talk. We have time for maybe just a couple maybe questions, and then we can come and interact with the speaker afterwards if you would like. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Really interesting and lots to think about on this. Early on, you quoted Shivan, who is basically saying that the change that we see in humans with reflectiveness is a change of kind and not degree.
Yes.
And then when you laid out your 6 principles, I was wondering if you could kind of combine those and differentiate within those 6 principles what's different about that model from the evolution of cooperation and sociality in species that aren't humans.
Yeah, that's a great question. So he's looking at the end product. The fact that we are, the Jardin is looking at, Tiard is looking at the fact that we are a reflective species, that we have become a reflective species. And so as far as how that relates to the 6 principles, I would say that is how that reflectiveness came about. That as that theory of mind, that ability to interact with each other got more and more sophisticated with time, as our social brain, our mind, our social mind became more and more sophisticated, and that gave us the powers to be able to, to be reflective like we are. The degree we are probably requires intentionality, where we're thinking about all these things at the same time and putting them together. And so that is what has emerged as a result of this selective pressure to be a species that is cooperative. Great question. I don't know if that helps. Yes.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It's a great talk. Really appreciate it. So is the inevitable part of like some of these steps in the changes in genes that allow for friendliness something that humans per se we're not controlling, but that God has built in, so to speak, and used our activity, cooperatively, so to speak, but that really was basically God's doing through the way God had designed nature? And I have a follow-up. That's a setup.
Okay. So it's not like there's this gene sitting there that its sole role is friendliness. Most likely, we don't know a great deal about what this gene is doing yet.